This is another track from Ares, stealth action VR game being developed in Roblox. It has pretty impressive AAA style visuals, especially considering that it is a Roblox game. It's very much a slightly more sci-fi nod to Splinter Cell, Metal Gear, a ton of different titles like that. So we have a similar structure with the OST version, right? Because we have these three different versions of the track. And then we combine those three versions of the track into the OST. Because we're doing an adaptive implementation, we need three different layers for gameplay. We have the ambiance layer, which is, all of this is tied to enemy alert states. So when the enemies are just vibing, right? And they haven't detected you or aren't suspicious of anything, they're at, call it level 1. And so that is when our ambience layer is playing back. If they become suspicious and they raise to sort of alert level 2, it swaps over to the suspicion layer. And if you go into full combat mode, sort of level 3 alert level, it pulls into the full combat track. After producing all of those, I then took all of them and cut them together into the OST version for people to listen to on the final release of like the album version of the OST, right? So we'll go ahead and listen. This one's a little bit shorter, so we will listen through. We will listen all the way through to the track so you can hear the whole thing, and then we'll go back through and break down each element of it. So there you go, Office. And this is the track for the second area of the game. So there's like 4 main areas that you play through, followed by a sort of final encounter. And you start in a medical bay, then you go into like an office type area, then you work your way down into the depths of the facility, then you end up in these caverns on your way to the final area, and then you have what's called the Pearl Gate, which is like the end game sequence. I was very interested in the idea of like diegetic sound design for this whole game and for taking elements of each of those areas and using them as a part of the music production. So because this takes place in kind of an office setting, it's a lot of desks, wood paneled walls, et cetera, et cetera. I was like, how can I express that idea or that vibe musically? So I ended up taking a bunch of samples of office related stuff. So like paper being torn, my printer, clicking on mice, typing on a keyboard, and recorded all those elements and structured them into a groove. So if I take all of the effects off, this is what it sounds like. And so we have paper being torn. We then have my printer, right? We then have that's clicking on a mouse. And then I think that's clicking on a mouse. This is typing on a keyboard. So all sort of office-ish kinds of sounds, and then a little bit of compression here and there, a little bit of saturation, bit crushing, distortion, all of these kinds of things. And you end up with this very cool kind of topper that runs alongside our main groove. Right? So it blends in there and doesn't necessarily feel like, oh, that's, office stuff. Like it's not immediately identifiable, but it definitely lends to like a vibe of the whole thing. Right. And that's kind of, that's how I like to layer my grooves, is to where you can't necessarily explicitly pick out any individual element, but they all kind of slosh together into just like a big, cool groove. Because there's also like, some hand percussion stuff in there, shaker, tambourine, maracas and tambourine, I think. That's most of the elements that we have going on with the drums, but we have a bunch of other stuff. So if we go back to the very, very beginning, we have this lovely pad-ish sound, which is Ethereal Earth again. I love Ethereal Earth. I use it all the time. Lots and lots of great sounds. But we also have another diegetic element, which is this sample that I found of a fluorescent light. And when you mix those two together, this is the ambiance layer of the in-game stuff. Right? So again, just kind of setting a sense of place in the track. Diegetic sound design, right? Then when the full track drops in, we have this really nice kind of alarmish string pad. Yeah, so I'm using Xtrem basically as an envelope shaper to make it feel like, instead of it just being a one smooth pad, it kind of gives it some rhythmic structure, right? And then we also have, the TB303 or acid from Arturia, which is like one of the main components of the track. So that builds over this little ambiance section. And then, of course, we've got our like sort of sparkly texture things going on. All our crashes, reversed crashes, this nice reversed kind of bell sound. Which, if I remember correctly, in my box of like percussion tricks back there, I have a front desk bell that you would see in like a motel. I'm pretty sure that's a recording of that pitched down and reversed. Halfway through this sort of intro section, we have this string layer that comes in, which is very like Jason Bourne-ish, reminds me a lot of the stuff in the Jason Bourne soundtracks. And that's another element that's kind of hanging out throughout the track. We also then have this big, glorious, super dark cinematic piano sound courtesy of Keyscape. Then our bass drops in, which is another real, pretty straightforward, like real bass tone. So we've got Amplitude again with our Ampeg SVT emulation. And then we're using this octave pedal, which this is like a sort of little module version of an Ampeg octave pedal from the 70s. That sounds amazing. Super deep. So very cool, very like Ocean's 11 kind of a bass tone there. And a lot of my bass tones I model after Tim LaFave. If anybody knows who Tim LaFave is, he's a phenomenal bass player who's toured with all kinds of super cool people, but he also played on all the Ocean's movies soundtracks. And there's so many, he's kind of a master of like pedals and cool bass tones. And there are so many amazing bass tones on those Ocean's soundtracks. They're kind of like whatever, love them or hate them movies. But if you go listen to the soundtracks, they're actually fantastic. It's incredibly cool music. So here we transition into this kind of like B section concept. And that's really like the hallmark of a lot of this stuff. I was talking, this is true of all of the tracks on Aries. There is a ton of automation, especially around these transitions, doing all kinds of different stuff on the transition points. So like right here, we have our Glitch 2. This plugin gives you the ability to sequence effects as if they were kind of like MIDI events almost. So the way that I usually use it is I will build a cool pattern out of it, then just use automation to turn it on and off or bring the mix in and out to kind of use it to create dynamic and sort of randomized drum fills and kind of glitch transitions throughout the track. So we have a lot of that going on. We have a lot of filter sweeps, which I'm using DJM filter, which is a great, I think it's free actually, great little filter plugin to do those transitions. So I'm bussing all of the rhythmic elements down into a beat sort of bus or send, and all of the instrument tracks down into an instrument send. It's like all my drums, percussion, everything's going to the beat bus, and then everything else is going to the instrument bus. So it allows me to treat them separately, kind of as two separate elements, and do effects and do automation on them separately while not having to worry about going through and doing it on a ton of different channels, right? So we go into this sort of B section, and the main thing that kicks in, well, we have two main things that kick in. One, the bass actually drops out, which is kind of interesting. Because it leaves you suddenly, it like really changes the tonal character of the whole track and lends to a sense of like kind of unsettledness at the beginning of this section. But we also have these super grindy guitars. Which again is my 8 string, and that's just me bending really slowly up. So here we have Mini Freak from Arturia. And I started with this preset, Too Dirty to Handle. And then I'm just playing with the pitch wheel a little bit. And tons of effects on this. Huge amount of compression. Abbey Road Saturator to give some really intense top-end saturation and distortion. And then Stereo Maker from Plugin Alliance. Really, really, really nice sound. And it's, again, being essentially doubled by what the guitars are doing. So then right there, we have this really crazy ass transition, right? Which is, I'll break down. It's a bunch of shit happens all at once. That transition took an enormous amount of work to get right. The guitars, it's like a little palm. It's not super palm muted, but it's a little bit muted and played a little bit softer here before the transition. And then once we get out of the transition, I opened it up a little bit and let it ring out a little bit more for more intensity. And then the bass also drops back in, doing the same. That same kind of bendy thing. And then we also have this guy that shows up. So that is a sample of a little metal tongue drum that I just hit once, and then I flew into sample 1. And then again, just ton of effects, tremolo to really chop it and give it good rhythmic presence, a little bit of ring modulation, and then Elysia Character, which is a great saturation and distortion plugin. So that's everything that's going on here through that goes into the second section. But so what exactly is going on with this transition? Great question. A lot of shit is going on with this transition. Like if you look at my automation lanes, a ton of things are happening. So the first thing is I'm muting a bunch of stuff. And if you guys could see my control surface, you would see right just for that transition, like half the faders in my session go zoop, zoop, because I'm literally muting things to cut off tails of reverbs and delays and synth tails and all this kind of stuff so that it's really clean and really tight. So that's the first thing that's going on. Then we have a couple of different little textures. So that's like some reversed guitars. We also have a few little percussion sounds. Like this bell sound, which obviously has like a huge reverb on it that gets thrown up at the very end of the sound. But we also have this tremolo, really fast tremolo. And if you listen to just this sound, and we look at our automation here, I'm automating the speed control on the tremolo to go from super fast to basically nothing. And you can see it so that it has the effect of going, right? In terms of how it's chopping, but doing it very, very quickly. We then have a second sound here. Somebody had sent me one of those like distorted meme screams. I pitched it way down. It's effectively just like a really aggressive kind of white noise vibe. Some stereo separation using real ADT. Again, same trick with the tremolo. Some bit crushing and EQ, which we are automating for the big, really, really fast filter sweep. And all this is completely dry while the sounds themselves are happening. And then the reverb kicks back in at the tail end of it. So there's the three main sounds in the transition. Everything else comes from the automation of those filter sweeps. So leading up into it, on our buses, like I was talking about, we have DJM filters sweeping up on everything. And then we're sending everything into a huge reverb, and that reverb is just muted while that little one drop transitions thing is happening. And then that reverb tail kicks back in with all the rest of the instruments. So it took a long time to put all of that together. And I didn't even really have a plan other than I wanted just a big, cool transition and what we call a one drop, where the first beat of the next section kind of goes away. And the combined effect just makes that second beat on the section hit like an absolute truck, right? So more filter sweeps and stuff going out of this section back into something that's more similar to the first section, but now we have some of these more melodic elements coming in here. So our piano starts doing some bigger chords. We have this kind of arpy sound, very spy, very stealth kind of a sound that comes in. And then we have a couple of different... We still have that arp. We still have that arp from the 303, but then we have this really nice kind of lead bell sound, which is actually ADL. So this is an emulator that mimics the Yamaha YMF 262 sound chip that you would find in like really old Sound Blaster sound cards from the 90s. You get a lot of very classic video game sounds with this plugin, and I have used this plugin on entire tracks and soundtracks before to get like a very authentically early 90s kind of game music vibe. Very simple FM synth. But I'm taking it here and, again, plenty of effects. or not even plenty, but we're using Wolf compressor to just really totally blow it out with the, transient wise. And then cassette to give that, really nice like lo-fi vibe. And then we're sending it into Seventh Heaven for some nice verb. And then just analog delay, which is built into Studio One for some delay. So like there's a character to it that is reminiscent of old game music. But it's also like, very modern and very clean at the same time. So again, there's that glitch 2 coming in, giving us those dynamic kind of glitchy transitions. And halfway through, our strings join that synth on playing that melody. Right? Just to kind of lush it out a little bit. Piano starts doing some bigger figures, and I think is also following that melody. Yeah. So like this is really where the keys get nice and loud. Very cool stuff there. Our guitars come in playing a little bit of rhythm guitar. Just vibing out on top of the bass, and then all our same groove elements. And then to close the tune out, strip it back down to just that like office percussion layer and fade it out. So that's the OST version. But what all of this started with was the actual in-game versions. So, again, everything is tied to the enemy alert level, and you have not alerted at all, level 1, then you have suspicious, level 2, and then you have full combat alert mode, level 3. And so the way that we're handling it in Engine, Roblox doesn't have a direct implementation for anything like Fmod or WIs or anything like that, at least that I'm aware of, or that the developers are aware of. So they're coding the adaptive implementation themselves. And we decided the easiest way to do it was actually to have 3 different versions of the track all playing and looping simultaneously that are all exactly the same length, and then just use the engine to basically switch which track is active and cover that transition with a sting. Like a sound cue. So I built that, which is just a big like alarm kind of a sound. And that covers the transition between these 3 different versions. So this is the ambiance layer. So this is alert level 1. The enemy is not aware of your presence at all. It's really just pure ambiance. You've got a little bit of that fluorescent light, which is kind of a sound cue for the level itself because there's fluorescent lighting overhead the whole time. Few little tiny office-y sounds. Like a little creak of a door, a little click of a mouse, just little stuff to kind of keep the player engaged. And then this awesome Ethereal Earth patch being very kind of Akira Yamaoka Silent Hill in the background, just unsettling kind of ambiguous voicings. Then alert level 2. This is just suspicion, right? So you're not in active combat. This is like the enemy's looking for you, or you've just escaped and they're now searching for you. So it's not a big full groove. There's no kick drum. There's no snare drum. It's all just kind of like toppers and tension. The only real like low frequency information we have are those big stings on the piano to just provide a little bit of extra drama. But this is all about tension. And we've got big like filter sweep, slow filter sweeps going on, bandpass filter sweeps going on with all of our percussion elements to give it that like morphing, evolving, spy vibes. And then of course, alert level 3. Is, the bulk of the main groove. but just packaged in a perfectly loopable format, right? And so all three of these versions loop seamlessly, but they're all exactly the same length, obviously exactly the same tempo, same key. The changes and the transitions you can see are like in essentially the same places. So like we've got 8 bars of intro, then 16 bars of a groove idea, essentially like 16 bars of our B idea, and then 16 bars of our C idea. And that structure is reflected in the suspicion layer as well. That's by design, because as all three of these tracks are looping concurrently, they need to be able to transition in and out of each other and always feel emotionally appropriate, but be interesting enough to each stand on their own as a musical idea, right? Because it's not like there's some big complicated system that's tracking the tempo and is only letting it transition on, downbeats or whatever. They're literally all just looping in parallel, and then Roblox is just going zoop, now it's this one, zoop, now it's that one, zoop, now it's this one, based on the enemy alert state. That's that part of it. And then at the end of putting all those together and getting approval from the developers, then I went back a little while later when we were thinking about the actual OST release and put together the OST version, which is just a creatively edited amalgamation of all 3 tracks.